Hello, awesome students. Welcome to our first virtual lab of the semester. We're happy that you're here with us. You know me already, I'm Dr. Conley, and in a few minutes I'll introduce you to my TA. His name's Cole Mercer, and he has an array of certifications in strength training and conditioning, and I think he'll have a lot to teach you. The point and purpose of our virtual lab today is threefold. First, we are going to focus on standard and objective state-of-the-art assessment techniques for muscular strength, muscular endurance, and flexibility. So the first part is focusing on what ACSM, that's the American College of Sports Medicine, has prescribed for individuals to use to assess, again, muscular strength, muscular endurance, and flexibility. We'll talk about limitations with those assessments and how we can utilize those. And those tests are specific for the general population, not for the advanced population or the highly competitive population. But we'll focus on the ACSM test first. After that, we're going to then move into some advanced techniques and some advanced assessment tests that can be used. And I hope that's informational for you guys. I hope it's something that you can use. Those tests won't be necessarily suggested by ACSM or others, but they're still commonly used at the Division I intercollegiate athlete level, and sometimes in professional sports also. So I hope that's enlightening to you guys. And then finally, what we're going to do is talk about, just briefly, some training techniques that we can use to enhance performance and to improve flexibility, muscular strength, muscular endurance, for general population athletes and then also for highly competitive athletes. So that's what we're going to do today. So I should also give you some definitions before we get started today. We're going to talk about muscular strength and muscular endurance. Muscular strength is defined as the greatest amount of force that a muscle or a muscle group can produce. And typically that's assessed through a 1RM, although there are plenty of suggestions and other tests that have looked at how we can maybe assess that or even estimate that, and we'll talk about a few of those today. Muscular endurance is defined as the number of repetitions that we can essentially make against a constant submaximal load, or how long we can sustain a contraction, a single contraction, over a period of time, say a plank or a wall sit or something to that nature, compared to maybe push-ups or sit-ups or something like that. And then finally power, and that's really the intersection of the amount of force we can produce, the maximum amount of force we can produce in the shortest amount of time that we have available to us. So that's really what power is. Now, just a disclaimer, we're going to talk a lot more about power in next week's virtual lab when we start talking about some of the advanced Olympic lifts and plyometric training. So we'll get to that later. And then finally, flexibility, as I think you all already know and have talked about in other classes, is the ability for us to move a joint through its complete range of motion. One thing that I would just hopefully get you thinking about before we start here, whenever we do an assessment test for strength, for muscular endurance, or for flexibility, oftentimes it's muscle or joint specific. The trouble with that is ACSM usually only recommends 1 or 2 tests. And then we have to make this assumption that that's representative for our entire body. In the case of flexibility, if we're doing a sit and reach test, for example, and we are assessing lower back and upper hamstring flexibility, many times people make the assumption that the whole body is this flexible, but really each joint has its own unique context, its own unique situation. The joints are different types, as you well know, which means that if we wanted to truly understand whole body flexibility, we would need to perform flexibility assessments at most of the major joints throughout the body, which is time consuming and sometimes not that feasible. So we'll talk about that. I'd encourage you to think about that with muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility. It's something we don't have to think about with cardiovascular endurance or body composition, which are whole body and systematic.
Hey everyone, my name is Cole Mercer and I am the teaching assistant for the course this semester. I'm going to be helping you out with the demonstrations today, and you'll see a lot more of my face throughout the semester. I am a personal trainer and a strength and conditioning coach.
Okay, so now Cole is going to start simulating a bench press movement. Bench press is the first muscular strength test that ACSM recommends. It's obviously for upper body muscular strength. If you're trying to get muscular strength, really we're talking about a 1 RM. Now, the difficulty with a 1 RM, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute, is doing the appropriate amount of weight. Obviously, we don't want to get hurt, and so following a very precise assessment technique is really critical. Now, right now, this is a light load for Cole, so he's doing great with technique, but technique starts to really fall apart sometimes, or at least we have the tendency to have it fall apart at really high intensities. So of utmost importance with the bench press is that the back and the butt are both on the table or on the bench, as you can see here. Hands are the grip is slightly wider than shoulder width. Obviously there's a nice alignment of all the joints at a high intensity. And probably most important at high intensity with the bench press, more so than anything else, is that we have a spotter. Now again, this is a light load, so Cole can do this on his own, but anytime someone is doing a 1 RM, it is absolutely critical that there is a spotter present because it can be very, very dangerous, obviously. So we don't have a leg press machine to simulate that. Most of you have probably done a leg press before. That's the second thing that ACSM recommends. Obviously that's to test lower body muscular strength, and you do a 1 RM with that also. What we will be providing to you, and I'll provide this to you in your lab report, is data for Cole specifically for his max values for both bench press and for leg press and some of these other tests. So the next test we're going to do is the grip strength test. And here we have a hand grip dynamometer, which is a great tool. ACSM recommends this test because these are fairly inexpensive and they're easy to use, pretty straightforward. This will test obviously forearm strength. ACSM says it's more upper body strength, and I suppose there's something to that, but really it's mostly forearm strength. But it's a great tool. It's one absolutely to use with clients and patients, especially that are beginning exercise programs and want to increase their muscular strength. So how it's used, it's held in one hand. First thing to do is adjust the handle. As you can see here, you can adjust the handle depending on what feels right with your grip. Once you have the correct grip for you, you would hold that down at your side like this, or out straight in front of you like this. One of two things, okay? And then what you're gonna do is contract as hard as you can. Go ahead and contract, Cole. Okay, and let go, okay? And you will record that value. Go ahead and do that one more time, Cole. Okay, great. Okay, so Cole recorded here, for example, 62, okay? That's 62 kilograms according to this, okay? And you'd record that and reset, okay? So go ahead and reset. And then you would do it on the other hand, on the left hand, okay? This is very important that we alternate between hands instead of doing multiple tests just with one hand, okay? So same procedure. Okay, wonderful. This was a 64, for example. Okay, thank you, Cole. So he can reset that. Okay, now what you want to get is 3 assessments with each hand. So you go right, left, right, left, right, left. You record all 3 of them, and then what you're going to do is take the highest value from both your right hand and the highest value from your left hand. Okay, between those 3 assessments, almost always it's your first assessment, but not always, okay? And then you're gonna add those 2 values together. So in the case if we were doing 64, 62, right, that would be 126. That would be the total grip strength score. And then you obviously compare that to the norms tables, which I'm gonna provide those to you guys on your lab report. All right, so now we're going to begin muscular endurance assessments, and we're going to start with the push-up test. And this is one that ACSM recommends, albeit the problem with push-up test is everybody's done push-ups before and everybody thinks they know how to do it, but there are some very, very specific things which ACSM requires. First, I'd like you to notice just the nice shoulder width apart of Cole's hands. The whole purpose is to keep the body straight. With the exception that female athletes have the option to do this from their knees, and so that can be a hinge point within this whole process. But first and foremost, ACSM says that the push-up test starts in the down position, and the individual should look forward. So the whole goal is to touch the chin and chest to the mat, and that's perfect right there. So Cole's going to go ahead and start. Up, down, and Cole can just keep going on his own until exhaustion. Okay, now the maximum number of repetitions is what we're looking for here, but the repetition, first of all, should involve fully up and fully down and no rest periods. So the total score is basically just the maximum number of correct push-ups which are done, as you can see here, without a pause or without a break in form. If the butt starts to come up, or anything like that, then we would need to, so for example, we would end the test there in this situation. Other things to watch out for, obviously the butt coming up, right, or them not going down fully. Individuals like to pause at the top of the test. They don't necessarily need to do that. Some feel that they need to go super fast through this test. See right there, that would be a break in form and you would end the test right there, okay? But the push-up test, it's really about reminding them. Usually what I do is if I see the butt go up a little bit or their chin doesn't go all the way to the mat or their chest doesn't, I'll remind them that they need to do that, and then they'll correct their form a little bit and be able to pump out a few more. But usually slow and controlled is more the route we're looking for here, okay? So that's the push-up test, fairly straightforward. Here's Cole basically simulating what the female athlete could do. Cole, go ahead and put your feet on the floor there too as you do that. And go ahead, Cole. He'll go all the way down. He'll start in the down position. Yep, and then he'll go up, right? Notice the butt's not coming up. His back is staying straight. His chin, as you can see here, and his chest are touching the mat. And obviously he's not pausing in between reps. Go ahead. ACSM used to recommend some other tests for muscular endurance. There was a sit-up test for a while, there was a partial curl-up test for a while, these focusing on abdominal muscular endurance. In the most recent editions of their exercise testing and prescription guidelines, though, they have excluded the curl-up test from muscular endurance assessments. The reason being is they're finding it's not all that strongly correlated with muscular endurance, with abdominal muscular endurance. So they've excluded those recently. There are a host of sit-up and partial curl-up tests that you can look up if you're interested. But for now, ACSM only recommends the push-up test. Eventually, though, they might recommend a plank test or some kind of isometric exercise. Now we're going to begin our flexibility assessment, and this is the single flexibility test which ACSM prescribes. So really this is just looking at lower back and hamstring flexibility, and unfortunately sometimes that's generalized for people to think that, well, this is total body flexibility, but it's not a bad test. It's just limited in what it tells us. Okay, so first and foremost, notice that Cole has removed his shoes. Okay, the most important thing you can do for someone when you're testing their flexibility is to have them warm up their muscles first. If for nothing else, if you're asking someone to stretch to the point of what their maximal capacity is and their muscles are cold, that increases the likelihood of some kind of a strain or other kind of injury, and that's absolutely the last thing we want. So how we want to work with our clients when we're testing on flexibility is one hand on top of the other, and the name of the game here is slow and controlled movements. No jerking, no lunging, no ballistic movements. And what we're going to have them do is slowly reach forward and push this little marker here as far as they can, okay? And once they do that slow and controlled, they'll hold at the end. We'll have Cole do this one more time to show you that again. Slow and controlled movement. Controlled, 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 back. Okay. And now we're going to talk quickly about some of the things that you need to watch out for in case you have to have them repeat their test. So most commonly, as people go forward, the further they get, the more inclined they are to lift up their knees. Look how he's lifting up his knees to try and go further. We need to remind them to keep their knees on the ground, okay, to keep them flat. So go ahead and do that again, Cole. Notice his legs are staying on the ground. Very nice. And it would be slow and controlled throughout. We should repeat this test 2 times so that we have at least 3 measurements to be able to draw from, and then we will compare to the norms tables that ACSM provides.
Alright everyone, so for this part of the video today we're going to be discussing some more of the advanced assessments that we use in strength and conditioning or in personal training. The very first one that we're going to talk about is a static postural assessment, basically just assessing what their skeleton is standing at rest, or how their skeleton is standing at rest. And then we're going to assess their overhead squat ability, which is basically an air squat with your arms in the air. And then finally we're going to discuss a couple of mobility techniques, including self-myofascial release, or commonly known as foam rolling, and then we'll go into a little bit of static and dynamic stretching as well. So we're going to quickly discuss the static postural assessment. This is a really good way to just start off observing your client and any major muscle imbalances or skeletal problems that you might notice. So here we can see there's both an anterior view and a lateral view. The main things to really pay attention to here are the feet and the ankles, the knee, the lumbopelvic hip complex, or basically just our hip area, and our shoulders and our head and cervical spine. So in the anterior view here on the left, we're really looking for hip alignment and shoulder alignment. We don't want one to be elevated higher than the other. We're looking for our neck to be straight and our hands falling nicely to our sides. We don't want our hands to be like out super wide as they're relaxed. That might indicate some major muscle problems up in the upper body. Looking down towards the feet, you really want to make sure that their feet are planted firmly in a tripod foot. So in your foot, you want to be planted in your weight through your heels, your pinky toe, and your big toe. That's the tripod foot. If we are too pronated or too supinated, then that can create problems that result upstream in knee problems or hip issues. Looking from the lateral view here on the right, you want to really look a lot at their lumbopelvic hip complex, really more specifically at their pelvic tilt. So we want their pelvis to be nice and level, not facing too far down, which would be anterior pelvic tilt, or too far back, which would be posterior pelvic tilt, which is much less common. Anterior pelvic tilt can create a lot of issues for the abdominal region and for the lower back region, and it is very common to see in the overhead squat, which we'll be demonstrating here in just a moment. So pay attention to the upper spine or the cervical spine as well. You don't want too much rounding up there, and then their neck and chin are facing forward without too much strain. And then also notice that their weight isn't too strongly in their heels or in their toes. It's right on that tripod foot.
The next assessment we're going to do once we've assessed their posture is an overhead squat assessment. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the client stand with their shoulders or feet shoulder width apart, and then their toes are going to be pointed out just a little bit, whatever is comfortable for the client, and they're going to take their hands and they're going to raise them above their heads. And then they're going to have their palms facing inward, facing each other. And what they're going to do is they're going to engage their hips and knees at the exact same time, or they're going to bend their hips and their knees at the same time and then drop their butt to the floor. So go ahead and demonstrate one squat, down and all the way up. Go ahead and do one more, down, all the way up. So now let's observe this from the lateral view as well. Up, down, and up. All right, so from this view, this is a great view to observe the client because you're able to notice a couple of things about their ankle mobility, hip mobility, and shoulder mobility. So as he's dropping down, you can notice that his knees are coming over his toes, which is a good thing. It's showing that his ankle mobility is sufficient. And his hips are dropping below his knee crease. This means that he is functionally capable of dropping all the way to the floor. And then his spine is staying straight all the way through the squat, and his hands are maintaining above his head. So real quick, let's discuss one or a couple of common issues that we notice in the overhead squat assessment. So the very first thing is when our client begins to drop down, you'll notice that their chest starts to lean forward. Their back is still nice and straight, but they can't get their hips below their knees. This tends to be because they have very overactive calves, overactive calf muscles, overactive abdominal muscles, or overactive hip musculature. You can do some sample foam rolling techniques in those areas to maybe relax those muscles. Another very common issue in the overhead squat assessment is everything looks fine in the lower body, but then as they begin to squat down, you'll notice their arms fall forward. They can't maintain their arms above their head. This tends to show an issue with overactivity of the lats. So you can do some strengthening of the shoulder blades, shoulder muscles, the teres minor and things like that, or you can even relax the lats using some foam rolling techniques. There's a couple of different ways to approach these problems. This next issue is probably the most common issue that you'll find with a lot of clients from the anterior view. And this issue happens to be as a result of undertraining, all sorts of things. But you'll notice that whenever they squat down, their knees kind of cave inwards and they're pointing in between their toes instead of tracking out over the toes. This tends to be the most common issue showing adductor complex overactivity. So you can roll out the adductors in order to relax those a little bit, or you can increase the strength of the opposing areas such as the gluteus maximus and medius in order to balance out that activity of the adductors. So there's a couple of ways that you can approach each of these problems, and the end goal is really just to get them to be functional enough where they can begin loading up and getting some higher resistance. So ultimately we want our clients to be functional and devoid of most of these issues. So next we're going to talk about the 1 rep max back squat assessment. This is a very common assessment that you'll find in a lot of gyms, and is a very great way to assess lower body strength in the form of a compound movement, as opposed to the more isolated form, which is the leg press in the previous section. So here what we're going to have our client do is drop down into a normal squat just to exemplify a good back squat, and then as they stand back up. So we're going to see from a couple of angles here, we can see that the bar is tracking directly over his heels all the way through the movement, and then he is standing back up nice and controlled. And we can see that his knees, as we assessed in the overhead squat assessment earlier, his knees are tracking over his toes, his hips are coming down below his knees, and he is able to control the movement all the way through. So whenever we're assessing a squat, it can be very dangerous to actually spot a client, especially whenever they're working with a lot of weight. So it is actually much more recommended to teach the client how to bail from a back squat than it is to try and catch them in a heavier weight back squat. So what we're going to do is we're just going to demonstrate this with a PVC pipe. As Dr. Connolly is going to squat, when he begins to stand it up, if he is unable to do it, he's going to drop the PVC pipe off his back and then step forward through and let the bar hit the ground. Okay, so now we're going to demonstrate the back squat form and everything with a little bit of weight here on an empty barbell. So the client is going to walk up to the bar and they're going to have the bar just a little bit under their shoulders. And then when they stand under, notice that both of his feet are planted and he's ready to pick up the bar completely. As he stands it off, he's going to take 1 or 2 steps back, and he's going to get nice and comfortable in there. And then notice that his hands have a good grip on the bar, and the bar is up on his shoulders, and that the bar is directly over his heels when he starts. And then when he begins, good form, the back is nice and straight. He's able to successfully get his hips below his knees. and then he will re-rack just as safely and squat it back down just like that. And that is how you'll have a client go through both the warm-up and the actual 1 rep max attempt. So the next assessment we're going to discuss today is the deadlift. This is a very, very common movement you'll see prescribed in all sorts of strength programming and in a lot of personal training gyms. So the very first thing that they're going to do is demonstrating with a PVC pipe. What we're going to do is have them start with their hands shoulder width apart or maybe a little bit wider, and the bar is going to be nice and close to their body. What they're going to first do is they're going to hinge at the hips and then let the bar drag down to their knees. Once the bar hits the knees, they're going to drop their hips and their knees forward and then pick the bar back up just like that. Notice that he is keeping the bar nice and close, hinging at the hips, and then once it hits the knee, they're going to go down to about mid-shin and then stand it back up.
So when we're actually performing the deadlift, we're going to have the client stand with their shoulder width or feet shoulder width apart, and they're going to start with the bar on the ground. When there's weight, it naturally sets the bar to be right about lower mid-shin for most people. What we're going to do is you're very first going to start by dropping into the deadlift position in the very same way that we saw Dr. Connolly drop into it with a PVC pipe. We're going to have them set up and then hinge at the hips and then drop down to grab the barbell. Once they actually grab the barbell, they're going to get their knuckles down to the ground, their chin up just a little bit, and then they're going to press and drive through the ground up to the knees. Once it hits their knees, they're going to extend their hips, flex their glutes to drive everything through. And then the very same, they're going to go back and then lower it back to the ground nice and gently. So from the lateral view, there's a couple of things that we really want to focus on for the clients, and that is where their hips are in relation to the bar and where the bar is in relation to the rest of their body. So notice that the bar is really, really close to my shins whenever I'm starting, and when I begin, I reach down and I grab. My knees are under my hips here. Hips are a little bit higher into the air, but my knees are slightly stacked over my ankles and over my heels. When I set up, I get a lot of tension in the body, and then I immediately stand it up to my knees, and then I flex through to stand it all the way up to the top. Same thing, back down. So there are also a couple of issues that you can look at while you're assessing from this view as well. So some common issues are people starting really far away from the bar, and what will happen is as we begin to pick up the bar, notice that my hips are high in the air here, but because I'm farther away from the bar, I'm now having to reach over, and this is putting a lot of strain on my back. So if I try and pick this up right now, I have to lift with my lower back, as opposed to when it's closer to my body, I'm able to lift with my glutes. Another really common setup for the deadlift, another really common setup issue for the deadlift is whenever people have their knees too far over their toes and their butt too low. So this is really common for people who have squat a lot, but not necessarily done a bunch of deadlifting. So this is where they're starting really, really low, and you may notice we'll review this form in Olympic lifting later on. This is a great Olympic lifting starter, but conventional deadlift, this is going to be really heavy whenever we bring it up. Okay, so a couple of considerations to make for your client with regards to the actual performing of the 1 rep max back squat or the 1 rep max deadlift. These are very, very tough movements on your body at that weight. You're working at maximum effort. All of your joints are, or all of your muscles are working as hard as they can, and your tendons and ligaments, there's a lot of strain on each of those areas. So one thing that you really want to consider is if you're going to be testing a 1 rep max back squat or deadlift, the client needs to either have a strong history of each of those movements prior to assessing it, or you can perform a lower rep assessment where you assess a 10 rep max or a 5 rep max, which you can then use to estimate the percentage of 1 rep max that you're currently operating at.
So finally, at the end of this section, we'll be able to provide you with a little bit of data to be able to calculate a 1 rep max based on a 5 rep max attempt by one of our clients. So next we're going to move into the muscular endurance portion. So for muscular endurance, we have a couple of different assessments for the upper body, and the very first one is going to be the Pullup Assessment. The Pullup Assessment is one that some clients may not be capable of performing, so this is obviously an advanced assessment for those who are interested in their back performance, shoulder stability, things like that. So what we're going to do is have the client step up to the bar, and to standardize it, we're going to go with one standard width of grip, which is going to be the palms facing away and roughly shoulder width or a little bit wider than shoulder width. The client is going to then chin in the air and chest up high, and they're just going to pull up, and they're going to perform as many reps as they can without rest. So this next assessment is a variation of the Pushup Assessment from ACSM. So this next assessment is going to be a timed push-up assessment for a total of 60 seconds. So the client is going to perform as many reps as they possibly can do in 60 seconds of a good push-up form. We're going to keep all the same considerations for form, which is the straight back, nice joints stacked, and then it can be scaled as necessary down to your knees, but we want to make sure that we're keeping good form throughout each of the movements. This is going to be up to you to decide what rep does not count or counts as a no rep, and then the client is going to move through for the full 60 seconds. They're allowed to take breaks in between their movements, and they just have to perform as many as they possibly can. The nice thing about this assessment is that it assesses the ability of the athlete to be able to recover after a brief period of working at maximal intensity. The next muscular endurance test that we're going to discuss today is the air squat assessment. This is just a max rep of air squat, which is assessing their lower body leg endurance. So what we're going to have to do, the client do, is stand shoulder width apart as in our previous overhead squat assessment, and then they are just going to perform an air squat down to the range that is comfortable, and they're just going to continue moving through as many air squats as possible. Note that this can take a couple of minutes. For those who have a high muscular endurance, they may be in the 50, 60, 70, even 100 plus reps for air squats. So the client is going to extend all the way out, and they'll be nice and up on their toes. And notice there's a nice flat back. He's up on his elbows, and his chin is in a neutral position. And what we're going to do is we're just going to ask them to stay in this position for as long as they possibly can without form break. So if you notice their butts start to shoot in the air a little bit, or they're having to drop their knees to the floor, these are all considered form breaks. And they're just going to hold this for as long as they can. So here we're going to be demonstrating actually doing a little bit of self-myofascial release or foam rolling. So what we have here is the common technique for foam rolling the quads. And what the client does is they just lay over both legs onto the foam roller. And they're just going to roll back and forth from the knee, top of the knee joint, all the way up to their hip crease. And then back. And then notice that he's going nice and slow. You want to be able to spend enough time along knots that you're actually able to release the knot itself. and then go back and forth. Again, these are recommended to be done for about 30 seconds each. So another variation here for the rolling out of the quad is the single leg rolling. And this is a way to be able to control the amount of pressure that you have and increase the amount of pressure onto each muscle. So if you have more deep knots, you may be able to reach them a little bit with the single leg. What we're doing here is we're just hanging off one leg off the end of the foam roller and then sort of controlling it here. One advantage here is that we're able to control where the pressure goes and change which muscle we're actually targeting. So here he's actually targeting the inside of the thigh, and then if he was to roll out, we'll be able to target more of the outside of the thigh or the lateral quad. One thing to note here is that you do not want to go all the way up onto your side to where you're actually rolling out the IT band, because the pressure on the IT band, because it is a tendon, you don't want it to actually damage the tendon by creating pressure in that area. Here's an example of foam rolling the hamstrings in double leg. And then here is how we might approach it from the single leg. Again, the same considerations. You're able to put more pressure and target the different portions of the thigh. So here is an example of foam rolling the calves, where it's basically the exact same position as the hamstring. You're just rolling it all the way down to the ankles and then all the way up to the bottom of the knee joint. So next we're going to show the rolling out of the glutes. So for the glutes, we have it's obviously a really large muscle here, so we want to try and target it really well. Our preference is just a single leg. So what he's going to do is he's starting right at basically the bottom of the butt cheek where the hamstring and the butt meet, and he's going to roll all the way up to the top of the glute, almost to the lower back, and then back down. All the way up and then down. So here is a way to roll out the upper body a little bit. So right now we're rolling out the lats. So notice that the client is up on their hips and they're rolling up and down the side of their lat. They're basically going to start with the foam roller in the armpit and then push themselves up and then roll it just about to mid rib cage and then come back down. Okay, so as promised, we're going to discuss an example warm-up. In this particular case, it's going to be an example warm-up for a 1 rep max squat attempt in the video following, but this is just some general guidelines for a warm-up. So in general, you would want to warm up to increase your core temperature, and that can be with some cardio, maybe just walking or running on a treadmill, a bike or jump rope, something like that, just for a couple of minutes to get your heart rate actually up and to match your general activity level. The specific warm-up is going to be the warm-up for the movement itself. So if you're going to be squatting, you want to warm up the hip musculature, the quad muscles, the hamstrings, the glutes, things like that. You want to bring each muscle through the full range of motion. That is the full range of motion for the movement itself. You don't want to exceed the range of motion for the movement because that puts you at risk for injury. The next thing that we're going to discuss is just a warm-up example for adding weight for a 1 rep max attempt. This number scheme can change, and it might change with experience level, but this is just an example. You may start with an empty bar and then do 8 to 12 reps on the empty bar or the machine, and then you add on a little bit of weight, say 50% of your 1 rep max. This is an estimated attempt if you've never done it, or an actual 50% number if you have a 1 rep max in a previous attempt. And then you just slowly increase the percentage and decrease the number of reps. Please note that as you start to get farther into your 1 rep max attempt warm-up scheme, that you are going to be starting to get tired. So you have to balance the number of reps with how long you're actually working until you create your 1 rep max attempt. Otherwise, you could potentially not see the numbers that are representative of your true 100% effort. So for the world's greatest stretch, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by inchworming out into a push-up position. So we inchworm ourselves out. Once we're here, we're going to get 1 foot up to our hands or as high as we can go. And then I'll start off by taking the same arm of the foot that came up and then reach to the sky, opening my chest. This opens up the hips. Hold that for just a second. Reach back down to the ground. And then we're going to take the other hand to the sky and open up and
in the other direction. Reach back down to the ground, and then do the same thing on the other side of the leg. Hold it for just a brief second up at the top, and then step ourselves back up. This is a great way to open up the hips, open up our thoracic, or create some thoracic mobility, open up our shoulders and our ankles as well. So whenever we're warming up for a squat, deadlift, anything like that, we want to consider the joints that we're specifically trying to use for that movement. So just for an example, I'm going to provide some movements that we like to do for warming up a squat. So when we're warming up a squat, obviously we're going to be using a lot of our hip musculature, our ankles, our knees, and even just a little bit of our lower back. So I like to grab a PVC pipe, and we're going to do the following movements. First, we're going to take the bar and we're going to put it up onto our shoulders. And we're going to get our feet shoulder width apart, and we're going to perform good mornings. This is essentially where we're just hinging at the hip, keeping our back nice and straight, controlling, and then flexing our glutes and our hamstrings to bring ourselves back up. We really want to focus on flexing the hamstrings and glutes to bring ourselves up, rather than just trying to stand ourselves up using our hip flexors. Okay? We're here, stand it back up. We're going to do between 10 to 15 reps of those for around 2 sets. The next movement that we're going to do is, if you need to, you can use some support either by grabbing a PVC pipe or grabbing a rack. And we're going to do some controlled leg swings. Specifically, forward back leg swings. We're just going to take here, nice and controlled. We don't want to be wildly swinging the legs, just nice and controlled up and down. This is going to warm up our hamstrings, glutes, and our quads. And then we can also perform leg swings laterally. This also needs to be very well controlled. We're going to start with our foot in front of us and then bring the leg out, just like this. Making sure to control the whole time, feeling the flexing of the quad, of the hamstrings, of the glutes, and really feeling the tension in your hips as you're performing these movements. For both leg swings, you're shooting for around 10 reps of the forward and back, and then switch to the other leg, forward and back, 10 reps side to side, switch legs, 10 reps side to side.
Okay everyone, so last thing we're going to leave you with before we terminate the video is some final training considerations for both strength athletes and maybe some endurance athletes who are going to be undergoing concurrent strength training. The very first thing to consider is that there is a principle that a lot of training is centered around, which is the specific adaptation to imposed demands principle, or the SAID principle. This basically states that our body adapts to stimulus that we are most commonly seeing, and that takes the form of strength. So if you're constantly doing lots of resistance training, you tend to get stronger. If you're doing a lot of endurance training, you tend to have higher cardiac output, you have a greater aerobic capacity, things like that. So we want to really consider what our athletes are doing and how they're training. And that really changes the way that we decide to prescribe exercises to them. Since we're discussing strength athletes so specifically this afternoon, I want to discuss strength athlete joint and tendon health as well as their core strength. So strength athlete joint and tendon health is so much more important than is initially considered at the beginning of a training phase. Muscles tend to get stronger much faster than a joint or a tendon does as a result of the blood flow. Muscles don't really have a limitation on blood flow, and especially as you're exercising, it increases the blood flow. But joint and tendons really don't get a lot of blood flow, so they don't adapt nearly as fast. It can take weeks or months for a joint or a tendon area to adapt to a specific type of movement. So please consider this whenever you're you notice an athlete getting really strong really fast. You don't want to just continually load them. You have to appropriately approach an adaptation phase. The next piece for strength athletes is core strength. This isn't just isometric core strength as in or isometric endurance even, as in our plank test earlier. This is total core strength in terms of the maximal ability of your hip flexors to be able to fire, maximal ability of your lower back extensors. You want to make sure that your entire core, abdominals and everything, is nice and strong and can move through an appropriate range of motion. As mentioned very briefly in the deadlift video earlier, we don't want to see excessive movement in the lower back, but a little bit of movement in the lower back is okay. We actually have a little bit of back extensor action happening whenever we're doing deadlifts. So we want to make sure that our core is nice and strong so that whenever we do use those core muscles at maximum effort, we're not going to hurt our backs, we're not going to hurt our cores, we're not going to create hernias, things like that. And last thing to consider, if you are an endurance athlete or if your client is an endurance athlete and they would like to do some strength training, which I highly recommend, then there's a couple of things that you may want to be aware of. Runners tend to benefit from reactive strength training. This is power training or plyometrics because runners only generate power whenever they're striking the ground at that particular time. So if we can increase the amount of force we're generating through the ground at that time, then a runner can get faster. They will increase their running efficiency, their running economy, things like that. The evidence for cyclists, on the other hand, seems to lean more towards maximal strength training, and this is likely because a cyclist will benefit very strongly from having strong legs. The harder they can push down on the pedal, the harder they can pull up on the pedal, the better.